Hello, and welcome to the Pro Series Conversations from CheckBox Pro. My name is Missy, and I'm the founder of CheckBox Pro, where we help school leaders become their most efficient and effective selves by matching them with ed-focused executive assistants. Each member of our team has over 10 years of experience in the education sphere, and though we may consider ourselves pros in some areas, we can't be an expert in every area. This is why we are excited to bring folks working in the education space to offer tools, tips, and insights to make the life of a school leader even more sustainable. Daniel Casselli is a lifelong learner whose passion for education has driven his professional endeavors. He is a former classroom teacher and youth ministry director whose entrepreneurial spirit landed him in the world of education technology. At EverFi Inc., Daniel helped run the business development efforts for EverFi's financial education program, and the company was eventually sold to Blackbaud for $750 million in 2021. Shortly before EverFi's acquisition, Daniel joined Class Technologies as one of the earliest sales hires and went on to lead K-12 enterprise sales and helped the company land its first 100 plus K-12 customers across public, charter, and private schools. Daniel brings his unique experiences to BuyQ, where he is focused on growth, operational excellence, business strategy, and client satisfaction. He is a graduate of Grove City College, where he studied religion and history. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Missy. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Good. So if our listeners don't already know, Daniel, you host a podcast of your own.
I do. This is honestly a bit awkward. I feel uncomfortable because I'm normally the one that gets to ask the questions, and today I'm in the hot seat.
Yeah. So good luck. And hot seat as it is, because you know nothing about what we're about to ask you. So
that's right. I hear this is a grueling interview, but I'm prepared.
Well, I give everybody your LinkedIn or your website bio, so it's very high level. You've kind of been all over the place, and you have a really interesting background, just even from your education up into, the work you were doing before BuyQ. So maybe give our listeners just a little bit more information about your background and how you got to where you are today as the president of BuyQ.
Sure. So I think I fall into a camp that a lot of people eventually end up in, where you're really passionate about education, you love learning, you care about the kids, but you also have this kind of business entrepreneurial itch that you sort of can't get rid of. And for me, like many others, my path went from the classroom into the only thing I could find that was the intersection of business, education, and kind of innovation, which for me was edtech. So I know a lot of teachers end up in edtech or former administrators, and trying to make an impact on K-12 schools through something like curriculum technology or some sort of innovative tool. And so for me, that was my experience. I really enjoyed my time in the tech world. And now at BuyQ, I'm almost on the other side of the vendor equation. So we help schools with procurement and really sit kind of at the intersection of how schools spend money and how vendors are serving schools. So it's been a really interesting journey, not one I would have predicted like most folks' careers, but love the work I do.
Love that. I know I was super intrigued when I heard about BuyQ. Because I do so often feel like, obviously I work with a lot of really small charter schools, and I worked in a really small charter school, and we'd get really jealous of these larger networks, because it's like even down to insurance, right? You're like, how do they get such a good rate? It's like, why do they? And it's like, oh, well, they have hundreds and thousands of employees, right? So they get to, and so when I learned about BuyQ, I was like, oh, it's meeting a very interesting need for these smaller single site, or can be multi-site schools, but kind of giving them access to a little bit of a larger network that maybe they wouldn't have had access to in and of themselves, and connections. So, talk to us a little bit about what's BuyQ's bread and butter, and then we can kind of delve into, because you'll have a couple of tracks that you all help with in regards to procurement for schools.
Sure. Yeah. So let me start maybe by taking a step back and just sort of defining a group purchasing organization, because if you're a school leader, You might hear the acronym GPO. You might also be familiar with terms like cooperative purchasing agency or regional purchasing consortia. There's a variety of different names. The name doesn't matter so much as the action, which is pretty similar across those different descriptors. And essentially what a GPO is doing is it's independent or fragmented buyers. So in our case, we work primarily with charter schools. We started to work with private schools as well. And as you know, there's thousands of charter schools. Many of them, like a little over 50%, are not part of any kind of network or scaled organization. And so they're a little more fragmented. As you alluded to, they're on their own for all sorts of things, procuring goods and services. And so those independent buyers are, quote unquote, aggregated into a group. And then what happens is a group purchasing organization like BuyQ acts as an intermediary to essentially leverage the perceived buying power of those independent parties to then go out and negotiate contracts in particular categories. So what we do with one side of our work, what we do is we actually go out and run RFPs, requests for proposal, at the national level in different categories, generally large OpEx spend categories like furniture and technology and office supplies. We run a bid, and our organization acts as that intermediary on behalf of thousands of schools. And so when we negotiate that contract, we're not actually guaranteeing the awarded vendor any sales. So it's not like we're going and collecting, Missy, tell me what's your paper order, and then I'm going down the street and getting someone else's. That would be really challenging, and it would be a total pain for the schools as well. Instead, we're representing kind of perceived buying power, so potential spend, and then vendors are competing with each other to win that contract because they know BuyQ represents thousands of schools. And so once an agreement is in place, this is kind of the final step in the process, any school can buy off of that contract with that vendor, and they're getting access to the benefits that were negotiated in that agreement. So kind of playing that back to the beginning, the step-by-step process is, fragmented buyers join together, total purchasing power is kind of pooled. A middle entity, in this case BuyQ, is running a bid and soliciting a contract. They're negotiating benefits. And then that group that participates is able to use that agreement. And so the structure is designed to give any school, could be a big school or a small school, more leverage in the way that they're procuring goods and services. And we're also trying to help save schools administrative time. We can talk a little bit more about this, but I know you worked in a school. RFPs are incredibly timely and consuming on the administrative side. And so that work is kind of outsourced to our team.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is like thinking about like the benefits, like the direct benefits to schools is, of course, like my bells and whistles went off. I was like, oh my goodness, they don't have to run an RFP because that's a beast. And it also is expensive. Like, I don't know if every RFP falls into this category, but like for some of the clients, like if they run an RFP, they have to run an ad. Ads in newspapers are very expensive, shockingly so. And so it's like, okay, so they've used time just to like think through all of that. Then they've had the expense of like posting. And then, the process of like going through and checking and making sure they've done their due diligence of everything that's been collected is just time intensive on that side as well. So, thinking, okay, so, we can kind of go in that right direction, but also is there a clear or easy example of maybe a school who tries to go in and on their own? I'm trying to think of you'll know the example to give, but the benefit on like a financial side of being able to tap into like this group purchasing power for on the financial side.
Yeah, I think a basic example would just be something like paper or copiers is another good example. So, something every school is buying, and something like paper. The price of paper, if you're not a nerd and not like in the weeds on this, it fluctuates a lot. And so for schools, they're often spending thousands, normally double-digit thousands of dollars on paper, which sounds kind of crazy when you think about it. But that's a really basic example where a contract like ours is often setting price for a fixed amount of time, and the perceived quantity is so much higher that we're just able to drive the cost per ream down in a way that a single site school wouldn't be able to. And so that school that may not be ordering the same quantity as, your super large network down the road, they can access a similar price per ream and benefit that way. So on the financial side, the way our contracts are structured, and this gets to your question about like what are sort of the core benefits, we negotiate what's called ceiling pricing. So basically there's a set discount where at a minimum, you're going to get 12% off this particular category. And when we award a contract with a vendor, it covers everything the vendor offers. So we're not bidding super discrete categories like black pens or something like that. We're bidding office supplies. And so a school might use BuyQ's Staples contract, which covers everything they offer in the office category. So cost is one piece of it. But I actually encourage schools when I talk to them not to get so fixated on cost, because you can play the cost game all day long. And we do this in our personal lives, right? Like we go on Amazon, we go on Target, we cost compare, and we're constantly trying to see who has the best price. Next thing you know, it's been 2 hours of scrolling. We haven't bought anything. We've wasted a bunch of time. And ultimately, we end up buying the one we actually want because it's our preference. It's the best value. It's, whatever the product is. And that's really true for schools as well. So cost is an important component, but it's not the only component. So that's sort of one pillar of value. The second pillar, and I always tell people it's 3 C's. It's really simple to remember. So there's cost, there's compliance, and then there's consulting or consultative support, which we'll talk about. Number 2 on the compliance side, and this is, I have to say this is not legal advice. Talk to your lawyers.
Yeah.
But schools are using, federal dollars to make purchases often, and they have to abide by, what's called EDGAR uniform guidelines, EDGAR uniform purchasing guidelines. And for most people, they may not be, stooped in the compliance, but they know we have to get 3 bids if we're spending above a certain threshold, $5,000, $10,000. So when a school uses a group purchasing contract, they're essentially outsourcing that open, transparent, competitive solicitation process where multiple bids are collected. So they don't have to do that themselves. So they could use, in theory, federal dollars and remain compliant to EDGAR. Now, that being said, liability and compliance is ultimately, the school's responsibility. I have to say that. That's part of the nature of how we fit into the compliance box. But that's number 2. So saving time, giving capacity back to the team, and hitting on that compliance piece. The third and final is maybe the less direct, tangible, measurable in numbers, but where I think a group purchasing organization can offer the most value, which is the third C, consulting or consultative support. And this is where we kind of act as like an intermediary, an advocate for a school with any vendor in our portfolio. So that if a school has an issue, if a school wants to know, hey, what are some best practices in working with this vendor? We have 5 sites. How should we structure our account? We have multiple charters and they're actually different legal entities. How should we think about that to keep things clean for audit purposes? We live in this world all day long. And so a lot of those questions we have experience on. And so we can offer direct support to schools in sort of that broad bucket of how do we optimize our procurement processes. And we do some of that in a straightforward, open manner. Any school can call our line and we'll answer questions. But then we also have a full consulting team. If you've got a much bigger project and are really looking to revamp your procurement processes, we also do kind of scoped engagements that are much larger. So I don't know if I answered all your questions, but let me pause there.
Yeah, no, that did answer them. And I do think you touched on it, which I'm trying to figure out where we'll weave that in, because I think that's also really unique that BuyQ does, is it's not just about purchasing power, like this group purchasing power, but it is that consulting piece, which I'm just thinking about. We have a couple schools, right? Like they're in their founding year or they're in their planning year. And like if you haven't ever like run a procurement process or like come up with these policies and these procedures, like that would feel very daunting for me, right? Like, and so it'd be nice to be able to have somebody to partner with to go, hey, how can I actually set this up the right way, like on the onset, instead of calling you maybe a couple of years into my school and I need you to fix it because
Right.
we didn't know what we didn't know, and now we know some things and we've messed them all up. So I want to talk about that piece, and maybe some of these questions will end up, you can answer them kind of tangentially, and that's great too. So we've talked about benefits. Let's move into challenges, right? When it comes just in general, like what are some of the biggest challenges schools face? If there's any outside of kind of what you've already listed, right? Like maybe that's right, just the cost and the time and those pieces. But when it comes to procurement in general, what are some of the challenges? And then if you haven't talked about it, are there any ways that group purchasing is solving those problems for them? Again, if we haven't talked about it.
So I've got 5 for you, and this comes really out of our consulting work because we see a lot of the same things. And frankly, we see a lot of the same things, whether you have 10 schools, 20 schools, 60 schools, 2 schools. The problems just compound the bigger you are. So the bigger you get, you're spending more dollars, there's more people involved. Unsurprisingly, the systems get more complex and the problems compound. But I'll give you 5, and these are challenges that group purchasing contracts, which we've been talking about, hit on a little bit, but don't solve. These are more fundamental organizational challenges. So I'll kind of go in order here and we can unpack any of these. So the first is unclear procurement ownership. Now, if you've worked in a traditional district, maybe you're down in Texas and you've worked for an ISD, you are familiar with the district having a procurement team. If you go to a charter school, outside of some of the largest charter schools in the nation, you're not going to find a procurement team. You might find a purchasing manager who's kind of in the finance team and is administrating like purchases on the back end, but not a director of procurement who's strategically looking at spend across the organization. So the first challenge is unclear ownership. For most charter schools, the COO and the CFO both think the other person owns procurement.
Yep.
And here's why. If you've ever sat in a presentation with me, I've probably used the Spider-Man meme because I think it's the best like representation of this, where they're all pointing the finger guns at each other. And the reason it feels this way is because they're both kind of right. The operations team is the tip of the spear on need, right? In the building, they know like, oh my gosh, this is broken. We're out of inventory on this. Our HVAC system's falling apart. Whatever it is, the operations team is the tip of the spear. They understand need, and they're often the ones people are coming to for, hey, we need this. You're the ops person. Can you figure it out for me? And the finance team, the CFO, they're the owner for how all the dollars get spent. And so you can understand how this unclear procurement ownership issue arises because there's not alignment between those two departments. And the downstream effect is lack of accountability, lack of clear strategy, duplication of efforts, uninformed decisions, and frankly, staff frustration because they're like, who actually owns this? Like, who can approve this? Why are there so many approval layers? Why can't I just get what I need for my students or for my class? So that first one, that ownership issue, is really prevalent. So that's number 1. Number 2 is kind of tied to number 1, and it's a disconnect between the budgeting process and procurement. And I'll give you a good example because we're in April. It's April 9th. Most schools have a budget set or a draft of the budget set, right? They were doing this in January and February. Sure, this year there's a lot of uncertainty around funding and budgets are maybe a little more malleable. But for most organizations, they know the dollars they're going to try and spend. And most buying happens late spring, summer, into the fall. And so the order of those two things is really important because what happens is most schools will wait until summertime to do an analysis or an audit of all the things that need replaced. And we have to buy this, and we need to spend these grant dollars. And so they're actually building the procurement needs bucket once the money has already been set, instead of the other way around, allowing forecasted need to influence the budget and to budget categories in a way that's data informed. So the disconnect between budgeting and procurement causes lots of frustration throughout the year, because what's the response? We don't have money for that, or it wasn't in the budget. Why didn't you give me the heads up? We needed to replace 50 of our Chromebooks. So that's the second big one. Number 3, if we haven't lost people, we're on number 3. Number 3 is capacity erosion. So what do I mean by this? This is where, as your school grows, your procurement needs evolve. And we could include, like you mentioned, benefits at the top of the call. Huge budget line item, your second or third biggest, depending on if you lump in, benefits with salaries. Your burden on your organization for procurement grows and scales as the organization grows. What often happens is the actual systems and processes that schools have in place for spending money are really manual and outdated. If you've worked in a school, I was a teacher, getting reimbursed for something, huge pain, paper form, send me a check. It's late. It was on my credit card. I'm poor. There's all sorts of, all sorts of issues. And that's just a microcosm. It happens with big purchases too, where schools are sending paper checks and the systems don't talk to each other and the PO process is super manual, whatever it is. Most schools have a reliance that's overly manual on their procurement process, and it erodes capacity. What do I mean by capacity? The actual hours your team is spending doing this work. And this gets, as the bigger you get, this gets to the point where you're adding headcount just to pay your bills. Your AP team has 4 people, 5 people once you get to a certain size. And so it really can get costly and time consuming, and it eats into particularly the finance team's day-to-day capacity, but also the ops team in intake and triage of needs. And so that can be really frustrating, especially when you're feeling like, I want to do more strategic work. I don't want to be taking and triaging and processing orders, whether you're on the ops or the finance side. So capacity erosion is number 3. Number 4 is access to financial data. So this gets into it. A lot of it stems from problem number 1, which is unclear ownership. But a lot of times access to data is very limited, especially real-time data, and it makes decision-making challenging. So what I mean by this is there's often data in silos, how much are we spending on curriculum? That question often is answered and lives in the academic team's, side of the house. How that fits into money that's been spent on technology is a little bit unclear. And then we've got instructional technology, digital curriculum programs that the tech team manages and kind of onboards and does the integrations, but the budget is a little unclear. Whose does it come from? And so lack of real-time reporting for department leaders and people who are making decisions means that they need to either guess or they need to go through a series of conversations, often with the finance team, to figure out how much money exactly have I spent and which grants did that come from and how much money's left in my budget, because I'm trying to plan this big implementation for this program we all agreed we were going to do. And you get the idea. It's kind of creates a culture that is one of 2 things. We typically see one of 2 things. You either have a culture of spenders or a culture of savers. It's like if you've ever gone to marriage counseling, one of you is normally a spender and one of you is normally a saver. And so, there's bad things on both sides of that, right? Just because your school has a culture of saving, it honestly means you're probably not using dollars you have to impact kids and they're being wasted. And obviously the other side of that coin is self-explanatory. So lack of real-time data is just a huge issue. If a principal doesn't understand their P&L, how can they lead strategically from a financial standpoint? And if the finance team is holding the keys to the kingdom and instead of driving a culture of accountability and transparency, it makes it challenging for the rest of the organization. Last but not least, and this is the one that I'll put kind of tied directly to the group purchasing work is poor vendor and contract management. Again, a lot of this happens organically, not intentionally, but as your organizations grows, you need more vendors, more needs arise. And there's a whole litany of challenges in this bucket. Everything from we don't have one place where we manage all our contracts. When does this renewal happen? Why do we have 5 vendors for this category and buy a little bit from all of them instead of having one strategic vendor for this category? Why is the person that worked here 3 years ago still the main point of contact for all our vendors? Anyone who's worked in a school knows exactly what I'm talking about, because you've had to dig up an old email address to log into the school's account with that vendor. So that last bucket ties directly to some of the work we do on the contract side. All the other buckets are the things we're talking with schools about when we're doing kind of direct support projects.
This is so helpful. And I was nodding my head the whole time because it's like, I said, yep. I have an example, whether it's from like directly when I was in schools or what I've now seen so many of our clients living through. I'm just like, and I think one kind of unifying thread that I feel like BuyQ, again, it's not like a unique thought, but it's just like the expertise, like sometimes investing for schools to invest in an outside, like one outside vendor who knows this so intimately, right? Like, and just recognizing like, if you don't know how to manage vendors, you'll spend so much more of your time trying to learn that and figure it out. Even personally, my own business, I finally had to hire a bookkeeper because every time somebody asked me for, revenue numbers, and I'm like, how do I find this out? Like, and it was taking me so long, and I was going, why am I spinning my wheels? This is not actually where I need to be spending my time, right? Like there's somebody else out there who is gifted and really smart in this area, and they've made it their job. So how about I buy back some of my time by paying somebody else to do this, right? And just like think through this. And, again, to the saver and spender, right? We want to be, especially schools who need to be very aware of how they're spending their dollars, and it's so intentional. But I think you brought up a point of like, people are filling more, they're creating more jobs. They're filling another seat. That's another salary that is like, might not actually make this process any more efficient, right? Like you're just actually adding another human in there that's going to potentially have insight and thoughts and could slow things down. Whereas I could, partner with somebody whose their whole job is just to fix and to own this very particular piece of the pie that I can then focus on the strategy side or whatever else it might look like. So I love those 5, and I think they make so much sense. Okay, so you've touched on it, right? And the whole thing, at the end of the day, we want to make sure schools have strong procurement policies and procedures for life, right? Like in all the areas of their, like you need strong, as a former ops person, right? Policies and procedures are just we love them. But why is procurement policies and procedures so important for folks to have in place?
Well, I'll add a caveat to your question, which is I would say policies and procedures that actually get followed are so important. So, most of the time, policies and procedures are like the pirate's code. They're more like guidelines rather than rules. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is policies and procedures often sit in a closet on a piece of paper, and nobody's aware of them. Nobody's trained on them. And the other is if your policies and procedures are just totally disconnected from the reality of your organization, like the lived experience of your staff. So I think they're really critical, but only to the point at which they are embedded in the organization and they reflect the desired outcomes. And procurement is one of those buckets where most schools are founded and they take another school down the road's procurement policy that's in the same state as them, so they meet some of the same compliance requirements, and they just sort of repurpose that. And they talk to their board and say, hey, it sounds like big purchases. We should have a couple layers of approval. Yes, we're all good with that. Okay, great. A document is created, and then it's never looked at again. And then 10 years later, someone says, do you have a copy of your purchasing policy? And it gets dug up and it totally doesn't reflect the organization. So I completely agree that strong policies and procedures that are codified, and that are implemented in the organization are super critical for procurement for a number of reasons. But first and foremost, it's going to save your staff time. My experience with human beings is that they're okay with rules as long as the rules are clear. It's super frustrating when you're trying to get something done and you just don't know how. If you're a new teacher, if you're a new ops manager and you're like, how do we refill our inventory in the supply closet? And if that's really unclear, they're going to go on an adventure, an expedition to try to get to the bottom of this question. And it really isn't something they should be spending hours of their time on. It should be automated, and not a huge stressor. So I think it saves staff time and keeps people happy, frankly, if it's clear. They may not like some of the policies, but at least they can't say it's unclear why we have these in place. The next is kind of the main one, which is, these are, especially if we're talking about charter schools, these are public funds, taxpayer dollars. Like, we want to be good fiduciaries, and having thoughtful procurement procedures really can stretch your dollars and maximize those funds, and frankly, free up resources for things that more directly impact students. And which brings me to the last thing I would say, which is that the experience really matters for kids. I was having this conversation with, I'll give a quick shout out to Ramy Fernandez. He's the chief operating officer up at Dream Charter Schools in New York. He was giving me a tour of their school, and I couldn't believe the thought and intentionality that they've gone to in how everything is designed, from the classroom to like the actual like carpet on the floor, products and services. And it was a strong reminder for me that procurement matters because the experience matters. And Missy, probably like me, if you went to public high school, like there was classrooms in my high school where I think there was maybe one window that was like 10 inch by 10 inch. And it's just depressing, right? Like, you wonder why people are falling asleep in class, because it's warm and there's no natural light and it's 2 p.m. And procurement, if you can do a good job of showing people in your organization that direct line to the student experience, that's where you start to get buy-in, and people are like, oh yeah, this really matters. It matters that our notebooks are not falling apart. It matters that our furniture reflects our brand. It matters that we're setting a high bar of excellence for our facilities because we're setting a high bar of excellence for our academics. And so that's where I think at the end of the day, procurement is ultimately important for schools. It's not just like buying stuff. You're curating an experience that speaks to, what families are hoping to get out of your educational organization.
Oh, I love that. I love that connection. And I think about even that I would imagine, sure, it feeds into your staff culture, right? Because people want to work in a place that they're proud of and that,
Totally,
looks
yeah.
nice and is meeting the values that they probably signed the contract for to begin with, right? And then, of course, with students and families, yeah, it's like I can feel proud and excited about coming to this place and I feel cared for. But then I also think about, if I'm a donor and I'm coming into this space and I see you all using your money in really intentional ways, I think as a giver, I would probably be more inclined to give, because I know that my dollars are going to go directly in service to these kids that are walking through the halls, and it's making an impact, versus I've donated and then I walk through and it just, it looks and feels not aligned, right? Not aligned to the picture you painted for me. And so if anything, it's like, great, that's just going to feed in more and more and more into other streams of income that can help you, again, just feed more into your goals. So love that. Okay, so what are some common mistakes that you're seeing schools make in the area of their procurement policies and procedures, outside of just not being clear and not being used?
Yeah. In some ways, it's sort of the inverse of the 5 different buckets I talked about: unclear ownership, budget procurement disconnect, capacity erosion, lack of financial data access, and then inefficient vendor management. Like, each of those has kind of sub bullets within it of mistakes that schools make, where like the impact of not doing that, or not focusing on that particular bucket is XYZ. So for example, like budgeting and procurement disconnect. A downstream effect of that may be really reactive spending. This is a common mistake we see all the time, which is just, it's whack-a-mole, where we constantly have fires that we're putting out, and whatever the dollar amount is, we need to do it. We got to fix that. We got to meet that need. And it comes from a good place. It's not, I don't think it's, rogue spending for the sake of it. I think we're trying to meet needs for our students and staff, but that spending may not be aligned to the strategic priorities of the organization and where the organization's trying to go. Or it's, hey, we've always done purchasing this way, thinking about capacity erosion. And the common mistake is we're just doing repetitive work that in 2025, there's 1,000 different technology options for you to automate away some of those things, for you to move from paper-based processes to digital processes, for you to use automation in the way that you're coding purchases, whatever it may be. There's still just a lot of wasted time. And as we talked about, that can also lead to staffing bloat, which now a lot of organizations are taking a hard look at as we're having some challenging macro factors. So I think the common mistakes tend to fall along those 5 buckets I mentioned, and the thread I would pull through all of those is just never having taken a strategic approach to looking at how procurement's done at their organization. And as I mentioned, I think the current environment we're in, there's a shifting tide where all of a sudden COOs, CFOs are being asked to make significant cuts from their budget. They're being asked to really think about every dollar that's being spent because they're trying to build their cash reserve. And so I do think this is a real opportunity, this year, next year, for organizations to take a look at the systems and processes. Like, that would be my encouragement. Start there, fix your process problems, fix your people problems. The dollars will come. If you just go on a cost cutting mission, you may end up doing more damage than good. But if you focus on the systems and processes side, which probably haven't been looked at in a while in a holistic manner, that's where we see a lot of positive ROI.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned this at the top, right? Like, it's like budget planning season. So it's not too late actually for our listeners, right? That are trying to think about if we've got school leaders and they're like, but I need to get this, this budget approved. You need to get it approved definitely by the end of June for most of our July 1 starts, but you can spend a little bit of this time now trying to be really intentional about how to make better purchasing decisions, thinking the strategy of your overall procurement process, and how you can make some of those cuts to have some stronger levers later. So, okay, I think this is our almost final question, because I've already taken up so much of your time. What are some of the biggest trends right now that you're seeing as it relates to the procurement operations, or maybe what's top of mind for leaders that BuyQ is supporting?
I would say some of the macro trends I alluded to. So everything from enrollment challenges, depending on what part of the country you're in. Maybe you're under enrolled and you're having to re-underwrite your budget, or maybe you have a tiered approach to your financial projections. That's a big trend, because obviously there's a direct line between students and revenue. Another one is just uncertainty around federal funding, how funding is going to flow, whether or not it actually gets impacted. Is the DOE still going to be there? Who knows? Obviously, the challenge is politics in the media. There's a lot of talk, and it's kind of in their incentive to drive fear and excitement around that. I have no idea what's going to happen. My guess is you have no idea what's going to happen. And so I think for most leaders, the real question is how do we lead from the front and be confident, regardless of what's going on politically, locally, nationally, and make sound, long-term financial decisions for our organization. So I think that's a big trend right now. And then on the vendor side, we're recording this on April 9th. Tariffs are kind of the hot topic of the day. there's a lot of to be determined in that category, and vendors are trying to figure out, how is this going to impact us? How does this impact our supply chain? Are we passing these extra costs on to our consumers, in which case schools are going to pay more? Are we not? Have we shifted enough of our supply chain to being US based where we can kind of, dodge the cost increase? That's a conversation we're having with a lot of our vendors. And I think the encouraging piece of that is, at least from my discussions, vendors are really eager to work with schools and be a thought partner, as opposed to, here's an opportunity to charge more, right?
Yeah.
That's in the worst light, that's how you could paint things. I am hearing and seeing the opposite, which is vendors being really eager to say, hey, we want to be a strategic partner of yours. We know we're an important vendor for your school. Let's plan out some scenarios over the next 6 to 12 months. Here's some products where we can fix pricing for you. Here's some other products where we think the cost is going to go up. And we want to put this on your radar now because we don't want you to be blindsided. So that's a big bucket, just in terms of, leaders thinking about their core vendor mix, where they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars with that group. So those are just some of the macro trends. And I think for leaders, the challenge is kind of blocking out some of the noise and focusing on the fundamentals of what's going to keep our organization strong and in a position to thrive over the next 20 years, not over the next 2 years. And so I think there is kind of an encouragement just in the market right now to go back to the basics. Let's try and hit our enrollment numbers. Let's focus on being out there in the community. Let's build a strong cash reserve. Let's focus on systems and processes. So I think that's a good trend, frankly. I think that's a good thing for schools, regardless of all the tempestuous waters that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, well, that's a great note to end on. That's hopeful. That's encouraging.
I'm an optimist. Gotta be. Yeah.
You have to be. You have to be.
Yep.
Daniel, okay, so I have one final question for you.
Okay.
As we wrap up, and it's in the spirit of my company's name, CheckBox Pro. What is one box, big or small, personal or professional, that you hope to check off today?
Today. Oh, man. Oh, gosh.
I know.
I'm on the East Coast. My day is almost over. What else do I need to do today? I'm going to say go for a walk with my kids. I'm going to get outside. The sun is shining here in Richmond, Virginia. So get my steps in. I guess that's the box I'm trying to check.
That is a great. I will also be doing that today because, yes, the sunshine is out here in Texas and it's not blistering hot. So I will do the same. Lovely. Okay, well, listeners, you can connect with Daniel on LinkedIn. You can also follow BuyQ on LinkedIn. They are very active there too to stay up to date on everything going on. They have free consultations. So if you have any interest in partnering with them around just you need to revamp your procurement process, or you just want a thought partner on how to have better vendor management or overall procurement processes, they are there and ready to help. So you can reach them at buyq.org/free-consultation. All right. And so they help your organization there. Also, if you want to hear more of Daniel's voice, right, he's got a podcast of his own. So you're
trouble sleeping. I'm told all podcasts will put you right out. Oh. We have some great guests. You don't want to listen to me, but we do have some great guests that you might be interested in.
Yes. So they are on all of your podcast platforms, Charter School Insider, and you get to hear from lots of the nation's top charter school operators and learning there. So, and then finally, I'm going to include in our episode notes, obviously a link to y'all's website, but also a link to sign up for using BuyQ's contracts portfolio. There is literally a no-brainer next step for all of you charter school and private school leader listeners. It costs you nothing. It truly is actually going to save you some things. So check them out. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today and letting me pick your brain a little bit about just procurement and then also affirming all the things that I've seen. But for the listeners out there, y'all are not crazy. It is hard to do this work and, everybody's doing their best.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Missy. This was super fun.
Good. All right. Well, until next time, everybody have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all for listening to today's Pro Series conversation. Our team is always looking for more pros to learn from in the field of education. So if you have a recommendation for a future guest, or maybe you are the pro, then send us a note at info@checkboxpro.com. And if you want to hear from more pros, then like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. And by doing so, this also helps more folks find our show. So take a moment to check that box off your list today.